Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when you are tuning into this. Um, Today, I want to share a brief history and overview of the land at UMass Amherst and some of the land that surrounds UMass Amherst. Um, I want you to know that this is very much a work in progress, and I'm learning a lot more each day, each year about this history of the Connecticut River Valley, and this is very much an introduction through books, webinars, talks, maps, and my own connection to the land itself. I am learning how to articulate and how I want to share this overview in this introduction. Um, in 2008, I was a part of a team that organized and co-organized a conference at the University of Hawaii, West Oahu. And this conference was on indigenous knowledge, decolonization, socio-ecological resilience, and really specific to agroecology and sustainable agriculture and food systems education. So kind of a mouthful, I know, but it was the first time that I was explicitly studying more deeply a history of land and connection to land, which surprised me because I had been in the Valley for 13 years and I teach about land through food. So in West Oahu, I observed the indigenous youth and elders, who were a huge part of organizing this conference, come together and really show and demonstrate to the conference participants how they connect to their land. And they did this through story, through song, through lectures, field trips. And I observed this deep embodied reverence and connection to the land that is absent from, and just there's more room for that. There's a vacancy for that here in Western Mass and with my relationship with this own land where I'm living. So after this event, I felt more clear about the urgency to continue listening and learning more actively through including indigenous knowledge into my work toward anti-oppressive, sustainable ag education here at UMass. And so I really want to acknowledge that as a white woman teaching at a land grant institution, UMass Amherst in New England, I'm committing to continue learning more, more stories of oppression, resistance, and resilience as it relates to land, stories about the lands I'm living on and teaching on. And I invite you to be a part of it with me, and we can do it together. Native peoples are not just history, they're very much present, and they're alive and they're here, and their voices are the voices that we must strive to include and seek out and listen moving forward. So the objectives for this talk, for our lecturette, I'm calling it a lecturette because it's not very long and it's ongoing, right? I told you I'm very much developing this as I go, but it's an acknowledgement that there's more to be learned, to be heard, to be explored, in order to tell a more complete story of the lands that we call University of Massachusetts Amherst, and to provide a very brief overview of land grant university history and how the story that I've been telling thus far is incomplete. And so we're going to look at an indigenous tribal history and peoples who first inhabited these lands of the Connecticut River Valley before it was colonized by Europeans. So I want to inquire and want us to inquire why our relationship to land and its indigenous history is especially important in our work in sustainable ag and food systems, especially as many of you are entering the major and just beginning your path here, studying food systems, or whether you've been here for years and haven't really steeped in these concepts and steeped in this inquiry. This is for all of us. And I want to recognize and honor the existence of present day indigenous peoples and nations, like I just said, not just in the past. So just a little bit about land grant history. The Moral Science Center, which many of you already know and maybe some of you don't know yet, is named for Justin S. Morrill. And this was through the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act, the statute which founded the original Massachusetts Agricultural College. In 1862, President Abe Lincoln signed the Morrill Land Grant Colleges Act, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. And the purpose of that was to teach such branches of learning as are related to agriculture and the mechanic arts in such a manner as the legislatures of the states may respectively prescribe in order to promote the liberal and practical education of the industrial classes in several pursuits and professions in life. So a little bit clunky, that language, but wanted to just sample that. The Stockbridge School of Agriculture grew out of the very beginnings of the Massachusetts Agricultural College, which we now know as the University of Massachusetts. So the Massachusetts Land Grant College formed in 1863, and we hired our first professor of agriculture, Levi Stockbridge, and enrolled the first students in 1867. So 27 individuals graduated in 1871 as the first class of agricultural students from Mass Aggie, it used to be called. So I'm gonna go back. So that's Levi Stockbridge in the lower right corner. And this group of people, these are some of the first people who worked the land in this role of Mass Agricultural College. And this is just a snapshot of UMass today, really different. And this is an alum who used to work with me in a powerhouse SFF student, Shoshi Salazar. And Shoshi was a garden leader at the UMass Permaculture Gardens, which some of you know and some of you have yet to know. And Shoshi's an indigenous student who did an amazing job at engaging the UMass community in the permaculture gardens in this way that I just think really transformed and continues to transform how I relate to that space. So I just wanted to recognize Shoshi and all that she's taught me about how to connect with the gardens at UMass. So as I said, I want to dig a little bit deeper here. The aim of the Land Grant Act was to distribute lands to raise money for colleges and universities across the US. And one of the questions I'm wondering is, where did the land come from before that? Like, where did it get granted from, right? And so I think the narrative that we tell about land grant is that the land was just wild and untamed and we're going to grant it and you're going to use it for the good. But that's not totally true. That's not true. And one of the questions that's been proposed in my studies of this is, who paid for that? And the land grant universities still continue to benefit, like UMass still benefits from being granted this land. So, you know, if in 1862, Abe Lincoln signs the Land Grant Colleges Act, the early 1900s, UMass evolves to include more liberal arts and becomes UMass Amherst. And then we look at where we are today. So much evolution and growth has happened and wouldn't have been possible without that land, right? And I'm so grateful for the Massachusetts Agricultural College and how it's evolved and all the opportunities I've had studying at UMass Amherst, and that the students have had in our program and are going to have in our program in sustainable food and farming. And I just want to strive to tell a more complete narrative to move toward accountability, which means acknowledging that there's a more complete story that's possible. And so this is an excerpt from a piece by Robert Lee and Tristan Atone, who were really investigating and looking at land-grant universities and where did that land come from? And so I'm going to read this. You can follow along. Behind that myth lies a massive wealth transfer masquerading as a donation. The moral act worked by turning land expropriated from tribal nations into seed money for higher education. In all, the act redistributed nearly 11 million acres. That's a lot of acres. An area larger than Massachusetts and Connecticut combined, but with a footprint broken up into almost 80,000 parcels of land, scattered mostly across 24 Western states. Its place in the violent history of North America's colonization has remained comfortably inaccessible. And so when we tell the story of land-grant colleges, it's uncomfortable to talk about the violence that took place in order to dispossess or to steal that land from Indigenous peoples who were using and inhabiting that land prior to that transfer. Hope you're all still with me. Now those thriving institutions like UMass perhaps seldom ask, where did that come from? We're naming halls after the Act's sponsor, Vermont Representative Justin Morrill, and their panoramic murals that sort of create this idea that this land was just gifted for free. And so, you know, that's sort of where we're coming in and wondering where was it before that? And so we're going to talk a little bit about the inhabitants of the land in just a few slides. But a little bit about the Connecticut River Valley. So the Connecticut River that hugs what we call UMass. It's the longest river in New England in the whole region. And it flows southward for 406 miles through 4 states. So it rises at the US border with Quebec and Canada and discharges in the Long Island Sound. So that's really long. I actually have a couple of friends who have gone on long multi-day week canoe trips where they've gone the whole length of the river, and it is long. And so the watershed encompasses 5 states in 1 Canadian province. And so it's 11,260 square feet. It's a lot, right? There's 148 tributaries. Where I'm living in Hadley right now, the Fort River, I live where the Fort River and Connecticut River meet. And so this is just one of many places where a smaller river moves into the Connecticut. So this is just a map, a visual to show you from Lisa Brooks. So Lisa Brooks is one of the scholars, Indigenous scholars at Amherst College, who I'm learning a lot of this from through her 2 books called The Common Pot and Our Beloved Kin, where she talks more about the history of this land. And so these are some of the Indigenous nations that were along the Connecticut. As you can see flowing up, this map cuts off the northern part, but from Canada to the Long Island Sound here. This is the map that I've asked and had some of you look at through the website Native Land, and you can put in any place, I think in the United States and some parts of Canada, any town. I put the University of Massachusetts and zoom in, and you can see the Indigenous history affiliated with that land and present day affiliations with that land. So the tribal territories, the Nipmuc and Pocumtuck, Wabanaki Confederacy, we're going to talk about these in greater detail, but just to give you a map for the visual learners out there, where these territories are geographically. And especially because many at this institution are coming from Eastern Mass. And so perhaps you're going to do a deeper inquiry of what is the land I'm currently on in Eastern Massachusetts, but I know we are all spread out right now. So the settlement patterns, again, this is a detail. There's so much to learn. This is I promised a brief overview in history. So this is just yet another visual for you to take a look at that comes from another useful site, the 1704 Deerfield site that looks at the raid on Deerfield and many of the peoples, the history. I highly recommend it. I think I have another slide in here that recommends you checking that out as a local resource. So the Nipmuc. There's lots to learn about the Nipmuc. There's way more than I can fit in this box about the Nipmuc, but as promised in this brief history, I just want to talk a little bit more about what I'm learning and about the Nipmuc Pocumtuck. So the Nipmuc lived along the rivers and the shores of small lakes, occupied the area as far back as can be told. The economic and subsistence styles of the Nipmuc people consisted of hunting, gathering, planting, harvesting in their seasons. They were agricultural peoples or freshwater peoples. They changed location within the season. If you've lived in New England just a little bit, you know the weather changes, and it's colder right now as we're in fall up in the hill towns where I just visited over the weekend. At night it was much chillier, so it comes back down to the elevation closer to the river, and it's a little bit warmer, right? So they move as the seasons move, and hunting, fishing, and gathering wild food. 600 members continue to be a part of New England's most historic and largest Native communities today, with nearly 600 members present day. It's a state acknowledged tribe, and one of the quotes from the pages I was looking at were villages were linked together by kinship ties, trade alliances, and common enemies. The Pocumtuck, again, just a very brief overview. The Pocumtuck were also agricultural people and lived in one of the most fertile farming areas in New England. So they were homelands of Native people that were really farming some of the most fertile land. They grew a variety of crops on this very fertile land, mostly in Deerfield. And the main crop was maize, corn, but also grew beans and squash, and the sophisticated cropping systems that we know today is the Three Sisters, but more than just the Three Sisters, right? And some of you have even farmed in Deerfield. If you've participated in the student farm, or if you know of the student farm, if you visited the student farm, that land is very fertile. The soil is amazing. It's river valley soil, right? Pocumtuck means swift, shallow, sandy river. So that sandy soil grows amazingly. And we know it, also the area where the Pocumtuck were around, we know now, is the Deerfield River. And so this is present day Greenfield, Deerfield, and the Pocumtuck are also Eastern Algonquian Indians. And so there was this north-south trade route of the Connecticut River. And east-west, we've got the Mohawk Trail, which again, this is like for another presentation. This is just an overview, but the Pocumtuck were impacted through the violence that took place in King Philip's War, and that's a lot of what Lisa Brooks's book, Our Beloved Kin, is about. I'm sort of, I haven't always been someone who has an affinity to history, and now I'm very much learning how to learn history. And I'm learning how much relocation happened as part of these wars and in this violence. And so in the late 17th century, early 18th century, a lot of the Pocumtuck were relocated to Schaghticoke and northern Wabanaki communities. So a little bit about the Wabanaki Confederacy. So this translates to people of the dawn, or people of the east. It includes many culturally related groups of Native peoples. And these were the original inhabitants of Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and parts of Massachusetts. So the whole sort of northern New England region, and southern Canada as well. And part of a much larger group called the Algonquian peoples includes all of the native nations of New England and most of the southern part of Canada and the Great Lakes. And so this is from the 1704 site. There's lots more to learn there. But the Wabanaki generally were known for craftwork skill, artistic embellishments. They were fabulous, excellent. They were known for their bartering and trading. particularly because they were inhabitants of this river valley that allowed them access to water, which was the means of transportation for trade. And their life was social. It's a large area, right? So I'm just making some statements, but generally the family culture was social, gathering for celebrations and telling stories. And time was spent informally and formally visiting relatives, friends, and gathering for these celebrations. And so there's lots more to learn about these groups and other groups, but I just wanted to provide a little bit of an overview as we're learning about the ALC and we're learning about the lands around Massachusetts, around the University of Massachusetts. I want to include this too. So there's lots to learn more, and I really recommend listening. It's such a gift, such a treat that these resources are here. The story of Beavertail Hill. If you have not yet gone for a hike at Mount Sugarloaf, it's about to look like this as we approach fall. I know it is Mount Sugarloaf, but there's another story that is worth hearing and worth knowing about, Beavertail Hill. And so I will link this so you can give it a listen. It is really cool, and this website has a lot of information. So the question I pose as an inquiry for us to discuss now and ongoing, and that I'm still beholding myself, is why might it be important for us as learners, teachers, students, farmers, and just humans to dig a little deeper into this history of the land that we're learning and farming on? I know some of us are remote right now. Maybe it's just the land we're living on, right? This question is significant because I think it starts with a lot of folks come to this major because they start to feel a connection or have long felt a connection or are longing to feel connection with land because you've grown something, you want to grow more things. And so for me, looking at the inhabitants of this land and how they used to use this land, the wisdom that exists in this land, if we listen, I think is really huge and worth inquiring now, as many of you are entering the major and entering this field, or if you've been in the field for a few years, it's just thinking about why might knowing this history be significant and be important, not only with my time at UMass, but just moving forward. Maybe in 5 years, you're going to buy land and farm there. What pieces of history might you want to know about that land? So that's just the inquiry. Here's a view from one of my most favorite places in the universe. This is the top of the hill at the ALC at sunset. Very, very special. Some of you have been here, others have yet to explore this gem. This sits on top of the UMass Agricultural Learning Center. Behind the UMass Renaissance Center, there's this special tree, and it is just my favorite place for sunset. And that land, this land at the ALC holds so much history, right? So in its transfer, in the transfer of land grant to UMass Amherst valued education. Massachusetts Agricultural College was the foundation of UMass Amherst today. UMass was just an agricultural school, expanded out, and now we're back to our roots here in Stockbridge. And so much happened in the 19th century that I'm not including in this video. I highly recommend that you tap these amazing resources of Dr. Wes Audio, Dr. John Gerber. They are the knowledge keepers of the dairy farms that happened in the 19th century, the agriculture that happened in North Amherst after the land transitioned, what and how it was used, because it's pretty amazing how this land has been used over centuries as agricultural land, and now you're here either geographically or virtually studying agriculture. And so what I'm trying to say is this is a really special place to study agriculture because it has a long history in being used for agriculture. So Many of you, I imagine, have heard land acknowledgement, whether you're at a public event, maybe you're in a class. I know that it's something that's become more popular in the last few years, in that it's being used to open up classes and events. And this is one that's taken from a website that's been written on the indigenous history of Springfield Agawam area. And I really like this second part of the land acknowledgement statement. A land acknowledgement is when I say, I'm Sarah Berquist, and I'm talking to you live from Hadley, Massachusetts. And this land in Hadley, Massachusetts is the land of the Nipmuc and Pecumtuck people. So that's an acknowledgement to say the land that I'm on was stolen, and the land that I'm on right now isn't mine. And I'm here as an inhabitant of this land, right? So we give these land acknowledgement statements, but often it's just a statement. And so this, my hope for this is for us to inhabit a little bit more of that space instead of just giving the land acknowledgement and moving on, right? So I'm gonna read this. You can follow along. I might stumble a little bit, but I invite you to follow along with me. So I acknowledge, however, that many indigenous nations from the territory we now call Southern New England still survive and still exercise sovereignty. I acknowledge in particular these contemporary indigenous nations, the Chabunagun-Gamog, Nipmuc, and the Nipmuc Nation to the east, the Aquinnah Wampanoag, the Mashpee Wampanoag, and Narragansett to the southeast, the Mohegan Pequot, Mashantucket Pequot, and Scotticoke to the south, the Stockbridge Munsee Mohican to the west, and the Abenaki to the north, among many others. So those are just some names of what's around here. Recognizing that the entirety of the North American continent constitutes territory considered to be original indigenous homelands. I respect the sovereignty of hundreds of other Native American indigenous nations that survive today, and we pledge to support the rights of these nations and the interests of indigenous peoples. And so there's an I, we there for us to consider how we can collectively behold this statement. I also want to celebrate. I want to celebrate some of the amazing student agriculture that takes place in the University of Massachusetts Amherst vicinity. This is a senior who I've had the pleasure of working with for many years. This is Avanti Dev. And this is, I think, in her freshman or sophomore year, harvesting potatoes at the Ag Learning Center. I think one of the greatest joys in farming. Potatoes are one of the main crops grown in Hadley and often grown monoculture, conventional, right? So this is our work right now as we explore sustainable agriculture and food systems. There's lots of agriculture in this area, not necessarily sustainable agriculture. And there's a lot of use of pesticides in this area. And there's also a lot of amazing production that happens in this area. And so as we study sustainable food and farming, we're beholding that complexity, right, of immense production and also the impact on the ecology, the systems, from producing and growing on lands like this, like looking at the erosion that happens, looking at the impact on some of these lands when we just grow monoculture. So we're in this exploration together, but I've seen students grow and participate in the production of amazing food and flowers. This is Kyle Ziegel, a recent alum, was just a senior, but just graduated this summer, was a student farmer. And this is at the Student Farmers Market taking place. So I just want to say I'm grateful for all the opportunities that have been opened through the land grant. So many students learning with their instructors to make this world and our food system a better place. Programs are still rooted beyond just UMass, but in the New England region and across the country, rooted in this foundation of the importance of connection to land. And here at UMass, Levi Stockbridge, his motto was learn by doing. And here we are, though in these times virtually, there's more learning to be had in hands-on ways, right? You have many instructors who really care about and value this foundational pedagogy that Levi Stockbridge had, who was sort of one of the first professors and found the namesake of the Stockbridge School of Agriculture. So learn by doing, here's two students doing it. And I also want to say that I hope you get a chance to hear more about this history from local Indigenous peoples, from other professors, from friends, about your homelands, about the lands that you're living on now, or the place you're about to be. This is one of my other favorite places in Western Mass. This is the Dike area in Hadley, where you can walk alongside the Connecticut River for so long, and it's so flat and it's so beautiful. Another amazing place to see the sunset. I'll show you a little bit more footage in a minute, and I'm excited for you to get to know this place. And if you already know this place, maybe I'll see you there. I ran into a couple SFF alumni there the other day. It's beautiful. Like I said, there's lots of sources that I referenced for this, and there's lots more that you can take a look at. So I'll try to link some of those to the appropriate Moodle pages. But thank you for joining me in this inquiry. I welcome feedback, and we'll continue this conversation.